I have the privilege of working part-time with the Oxford Centre on Christian Apologetics, and we take great pride in the fact that it's a very, very practical course. But we consider Biola the world's center of academic apologetics. So it's a real delight to be here, great delight. As Harry said, I was born in China. I grew up with my parents in Nanjing, which was the capital of China under Chiang Kai-shek. Nanjing had been brutalized in the rape of Nanking in 1937-38, and it was threatened by the looming armies of Mao Zedong and Lin Biao coming down from the north. But for all the troubles around it, you could still see the beauty of what was the ancient capital of the Ming Dynasty in China. In 1500, Nanjing was the capital of the most powerful, prosperous country in the world. The Ming emperors had sent a fleet to Africa with ships that were 4 times the size of Christopher Columbus's. They had sent 1 million men to build 100,000 buildings, which formed the Forbidden City, as we call it now, in the new capital of Beijing. No one in 1500 would have believed that what they considered a cultural backwater on the western end of the Asian landmass would ever rival China. And yet suddenly, and for 500 years, Europe dominated the world and humiliated the Chinese. And as China in the last century has regained its power, they raised the question, why? How did it happen? And Neil Ferguson, the historian, describes how there was a session at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences when they went through the explanations as to why China was humiliated. Was it Western guns? No. Was it Western economy? Partly, but no. Was it Western laws? No. Was it Western politics, democracy? No. Their final conclusion was it was Western religion. In other words, the Christian faith. But some of the Jewish scholars entered the discussion and pointed out rightly, that's not quite accurate. Because if you think, the Christian faith had been dominant in Europe since the 4th century, and yet it never dominated the world. What was it in the last 500 years? And of course the answer, the Reformation. The Reformation. So here we are in the year of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, and the question is, what was it about the Reformation which put such a powerful stamp on world history? Many people say the Reformation is the single strongest force that has created the modern world, even if in many ways it's despite the intentions of the reformers. But what was it? Now, in this year of the anniversary, many people have lamented the Reformation because of the division of the church. But of course, it was the second grand division. And a tragedy maybe, but a tragic necessity because of the profundity of the corruptions it was dealing with. But those who celebrated the Reformation have often stopped by looking at the impact of the Reformation on the church, the recovery of the gospel, the restoration of the authority of Scripture, and the new understanding of the place of lay people, and so on. But that doesn't go far enough in explaining how did the Reformation and its influence create so much of the modern world. Well, there's a whole series of things that are the so-called gifts of the Reformation. For me, the top 3, and there are actually 6, all beginning with C, the top 3 would be, in reverse order, conscience, because while Christians were the pioneers of religious freedom, Tertullian in the 2nd century, Lactantius, behind the Edict of Milan, and Lactantius, as you know, was the tutor to the Emperor Constantine's son. And the Edict of Milan doesn't make the Christian faith legitimate or established, but rather is an edict virtually of religious freedom, and he's behind that. But of course, there were centuries in which the church perpetrated the opposite of religious freedom. And modern religious freedom starts with people like Thomas Howells, Roger Williams, Isaac Backus, and many people who are the direct heirs of the Reformation. A second powerful C is calling. Max Weber even argues that it was calling which is behind the rise of capitalism, a highly controversial thesis in the social sciences, but there's no question the calling's behind purpose, dynamism, entrepreneurialism, and so much of the drive of our Western world. But I want to talk tonight about the one that many people, Christians included, overlook. A third C, covenant. Because what's not realized is that covenant is the origin of the American Constitution. And I want to argue tonight that not only do we have a key to understanding the American Republic, we have a vital key to how Christians can contribute to the present crisis of the American Republic, the whole notion of covenant. Clearly, Exodus is the master story of Western freedom, certainly in the English-speaking world, although again, obviously, not in some of the other traditions. So it's the story behind the English Revolution, and it's the story behind the American Revolution, but not the French Revolution, not the Russian Revolution, and not the Chinese Revolution. They are much closer to Friedrich Nietzsche, who in his book Genealogy of Morals calls Exodus the slave revolt in morality. And he wants to overcome the power of the herd and replace it once again with the power of the hero. A very different view of freedom and of societies. But let me lay out a number of propositions that get to the heart, historically, of this notion of covenantalism and its contribution to constitutional freedom. First, appreciate the place of covenant in political thinking. Any of you who have been through Political Science 101, you immediately get back to the notions of the Greeks, the Greek and the Roman classifications, and you have three types of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And of course, each one has a corrupt form as well as an ideal form. Monarchy, the rule of one, corrupted into tyranny. Aristocracy, the rule of the excellent few, corrupted into oligarchy. And democracy, the rule of the people, of the many, corrupted into mob rule. And the Greeks had a vivid sense of dynamism, and the wheel always turns. So it's not that you choose one and you stay with it forever. No, no. There's entropy, there's dynamism. Nothing lasts forever. The wheel turns. But each of those forms is looking at governments. But in the last 50 years, there's been a new attempt to look not just at governments, but at societies, and particularly their founding. And if you think of that as a different three. One would be organic societies, which are linked together by blood and kinship. You think of a Scottish clan or an African tribe, blood and kinship. Obviously, fewer of those in the modern world because of change, mobility, and various other factors, but very powerful in history. The second type of founding is the most common and the most powerful of all, which is hierarchical societies. Societies that are linked by force and conquest, such as a kingdom or, supremely, an empire. The Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Chinese Empire, whatever it is. The third type of government is covenantal, linked by a freely chosen binding agreement of the people, and supremely three: the Jews, The Swiss, going back to the Articles of Confederation in the 13th century, and the United States. Now, what was it about covenants in the book of Exodus that was so distinctive that it put a stamp on history? We all know there were other covenants. You had the Hittite covenants, the so-called suzerainty treaties. Alexander the Great had his Corinthian League. I am an Irishman in background, and we Celtic societies had our oath communities and our oath societies. So covenants are not unique to the Bible. And of course there are other covenants apart from Sinai. The covenant with Noah and humanity after the flood. The covenant with Abraham and his family in mid-Genesis. But Sinai is distinctive. For one thing, God himself is a partner. It's not a covenant that's under God or sworn by God or whatever. God himself, the Lord himself, is a partner. Even more distinctively, it's a covenant with everybody. Easy to say, but the Greeks didn't do that. You look back at Athens, only 20% of the men were able to vote. 80% unable. And of course, none of the women, none of the children, none of the foreigners. A very, very limited franchise, to put it mildly. But in Exodus, it's the men, it's the women, it's the children, and most remarkably of all, it's those born and those yet to be born. It's an intergenerational project of God with the whole of the people. And then the third distinctive feature, it covers the whole of life. Go to the Hittite treaties and others, they are narrow legal contracts. You don't want to be bound everywhere. No. You want to have a narrow sense, you're bound by this, but not that. Not with the Sinai covenant. It covers business, it covers sex, it covers farming, it covers the whole of the way of life of the Jewish people. But those weren't the features that made the difference down through history. It was another three. And these are important to understand in terms of American Republic. First, covenantalism was a matter of freely chosen consent. It is not a theocracy. The rabbis rightly reject that completely. It was not a theocracy. It was a nomocracy, the rule of law, but the people signed on. 3 times, it says in Genesis, the people say, all that the Lord says, we will do. And that, of course, is the origin of the consent of the governed. The consent of the governed. So much behind the American freedom. Now, the Jews underscore that there is in Hebrew no word for obedience. Unlike, say, Islam, which means submission. The nearest is their word, shema, or to listen. But it carries the idea that listening is far more than physical hearing, the Old English word heeding, or hearkening. In other words, listening, deliberating, and deciding whether or not you will respond accordingly. So it's a fully focused attention leading to acting according to what you've heard. And that's the notion of obedience through listening, because it's a freely chosen consent. Secondly, it was a morally binding pledge. As I said, it's a covenant and not a contract. And you can think of the way it touches, say, marriages, for better or worse, sickness in health, and all those sort of things, until death do us part. That's pretty comprehensive and long-lasting. Whereas you take what I hear from sociology is the widest Californian vow in marriages, which is not till death do us part, but so long as love lasts. Which, knowing how fickle Cupid can be, is often not very long. a morally binding pledge. But the third feature is the key one: the reciprocal responsibility of all for all. This is the Three Musketeers on a far grander scale many centuries earlier. All for one and one for all. One rabbi puts it, there wasn't one covenant, there were 600,000 covenants. And another rabbi answered, no, that's wrong. He said, there's 600,000 times 600,000. Work that out in your calculator. In other words, every Jew there making a covenant with the Lord and making a covenant, all of them with each other. And that, of course, is the origin of love your neighbor as yourself. Reciprocal responsibility. And even more remarkably, that is said once in Leviticus, but puts an incredible stamp on the ethical understanding down through history, the love of the neighbor like oneself. But more than 30 times it talks about the care and the love for the stranger. Now again, we compare it with the Greeks. Aristotle says you've got to care, quote, for people like us. The family cares for the family, the tribe for the tribe, the clan for the clan. No, in the Jewish concept, the stranger is not what the Greeks call the barbarians, this unintelligible babble of language. No, the stranger may not be in our image, truly a stranger, but whoever he or she is in God's image, and therefore is cared for like us. And you have a very different idea of the reciprocal responsibility of all for all. I'm not spelling it out yet at the moment, but think for a second. Democracy has zero social content. All it tells you who rules, supposedly. The rulers are us. It says nothing about anything else within democracy. Whereas covenantalism, constitutionalism, requires everything of the people, the citizens within it. And you can see that if there are rights, they grow out of responsibilities. And the responsibilities are reciprocal from the very beginning. It's all about relationships. Notice, in Sinai, there's no king. Relationships precede regimes. In other words, in the Jewish system, the quality of the relationships always, therefore families and other relationships, always more important than who's in charge. Not the way we think today. We think of the administrations and the presidents and all this stuff, and we don't really care about the quality of relationships, which may be shot through with problems as they are now. And yet in the Sinai system, relationships outweigh regimes in that covenantal reciprocal responsibility of all for all. Now, if those are the distinctive features, how did that shape history? Are we just talking about the Exodus and leaving it there? No. The first obvious impact was on the Jews. As I said, monarchy came centuries later. And of course, if you think, when the Jews lost their monarchy, and the temple was destroyed, and their homeland was ransacked, and they were scattered to the four corners of the earth, and viciously persecuted, tragically, by fellow Christians, by Christians like us, what kept them together? Covenant. And you can see how profound the notion of covenant was in underlying the survival of the Jewish people behind the most intense persecution and the most horrendous scattering across the earth. And again, relationships matter more than regimes. Or as the Jews put it, schooling matters more than armies. But that's only the beginning. The second great period of influence was the Reformation. Now, what about the previous centuries? Well, as historians say, and I just say this as a matter of record, not poking at anyone, when the church dominated in the 4th century, it unwittingly, uncritically, copied too many Greek ideas and too many Roman institutions without thinking. And if you look at the history of, say, the medieval church, they are Roman structures Christianized, so the papacy being roughly the reflection of the Caesars. And you all know the famous saying, all power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. That, of course, is said by a Catholic layman, Lord Acton, who was arguing against people who said that the papacy should be exempt from human criticism. And he, as a Catholic, was saying no. Later, in 1870, when papal infallibility came in, Lord Acton opposed it in the name of freedom, and he argued bluntly that the cardinals went in as shepherds and came out as sheep, as he put it bluntly. In other words, he was saying that the structures of the church from the 4th century onwards were not biblical. They were not covenantal. They were Roman. And being hierarchical, they were built on power and force and conquest. And of course, when power is corrupted, it becomes oppressive and evil. Think the Inquisition. Think the pogroms, the forced baptism of Jews, and all these sort of things. Horrendous things. But Pope John Paul II was candid enough to confess more than 70 times, but are still strung around our necks as Christians because of the evil perpetrated in the name of the church with its hierarchical, non-biblical, non-covenantal structures. Because, of course, if you think, the obvious problem of corrupt power is it oppresses the weak. But the less obvious problem of corrupt power is that it corrupts the powerful. Just as evil always has two faces, one is its face towards the victim, the other is the internal face of how evil distorts and changes and enslaves the evildoer. The Reformation reversed that. Not immediately, not fully consistently, but you can see Calvin went back to Exodus. Now, even, let's be honest, as evangelicals, many people say, we go back to the Exodus, yes, but it's a foretaste of my salvation, our salvation. In other words, we individualize it, we personalize it, we spiritualize it, whereas the Reformation said, no, it is a template for human relations, including political relations. And so you see the exploration in Calvin, and then through Zwingli, and then through Knox, and then Oliver Cromwell in the English Revolution. And Cromwell says, Exodus is the only direct parallel to what we're trying to do in the English Revolution. Now, of course, many of you know your history. The English Revolution failed. The king came back. But what is called by historians the lost cause in England became the winning cause in New England. And you can see that the Mayflower Compact is a covenant. John Winthrop's sermon on the Arbella, Model of Christian Charity, is all about covenant. And the Puritans brought covenant into their churches, into their marriages, into their townships, and of course the Constitution of Massachusetts is, as John Adams says, a covenant. And then of course you get down to the 18th century when both Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson tried to put symbols from the Exodus into the seal of the United States. And the U.S. Constitution, we the people, etc., is a nationalized, secularized form of covenant. And you can see the Exodus spilling down longer. You should have traces in Europe. As I said, the English Revolution was the lost cause, but that liberalism which was there was carried on by the party which were called the Whigs. And where did that word come from? It came from the Scottish Whigamore, which meant the Covenanters. And so you can see this powerful idea there. And through this, it's been secularized, and of course, many nations of the world now have their own particular forms of covenant following the US, but often without much success. And you can see here, if the Jewish covenant was a covenant with God, and the US Constitution is a constitution under God. Today, America is a constitution without God. And the question is, what is the binding center that holds things together? Or are we closer to W.B. Yeats and his great poem, The Second Coming? Turning in the widening gyre, the falcon does not hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. And you can see the problem of covenantalism without some center of a binding agreement. But let me move on to a very important part of the discussion. What are the strengths and weaknesses of covenantalism? Whether we're talking about marriage, or a church, or a society, or a nation like the United States. And you know that all systems of government, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, they have pluses and minuses. And none of them, we'd say in a fallen world, none of them last forever. The wheel, as the Greeks say, keeps turning. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of covenantalism? And they're quite clear even in the scriptures. The great strength of it is its bringing together faith, freedom, and responsibility. Most of you are Americans, I imagine. Words like faith, freedom, family, they're sort of little F's, they all just roll off the tongue in this country as if they're always gone together, will always go together, and they're a happy kind of trio. They are rare. And you only need to read, say, Democracy in America by Tocqueville to capture the rareness. Here he is, Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman, coming after the French Revolution has ravished his own family as well as France, coming across looking at this new American democracy. And in his introduction, he says quite simply, I'm paraphrasing rather loosely, but I haven't got it in front of me, he says, talking most of European history, those who loved religion fought liberty, and those who loved liberty fought religion. And of course, that's the European experience, because you had state churches, established power, easily corrupted, often oppressive, and so on. Take France. Diderot, the encyclopedist, his cry was picked up by the Jacobin radical, we will never be free until the last king is strangled with the guts of the last priest. A little brutal and gory, but you get the idea. Church and state, throne and altar, total collusion, both oppressive. The revolution throws off both. That's the European way. Those who loved religion fought liberty. Those who loved liberty fought religion. And that's French laïcité, the strictest separation of church and state, and so on. And there's no question, rather sadly, that the single strongest factor which has made European secularity is reactions, powerful centuries-long reactions against corrupt and oppressive state churches. And Europe's still living it down today. But Tocqueville says, I come to this country with that background, and what amazed me first is the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty go hand in hand. Faith and freedom support each other. Never take that for granted. And if they're divided and divorced, you might get back to something more like the original situation. That's the great gift of covenantalism. Brings together faith, freedom, and reciprocal responsibility in that powerful way. There are other gifts too. I love the fact that one of the great gifts of the Reformation is its reversal of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is one of the blackest stains in the history of the Christian church, the way we have treated God's people, the Jews. But thank God that while, say, Luther, the late Luther in his diatribes, was every bit medieval, it was the Reformation which began to reverse that. The Dutch brought the Jews back. Cromwell invited them back to England. And then, glory of glories, it was the evangelicals, not the evangelicals today in the Christian right, no, long before that, Wilberforce was strongly in favor of the restoration of the Jews to a homeland. And after him, Lord Shaftesbury and many, many others, right down, I'm glad my own great-grandfather was behind the signing of the Balfour Declaration, of which this is the 100th anniversary. That's another story. But it was the Reformation which reversed anti-Semitism and introduced what the Jews called philo-Semitism. And it's been argued that evangelicals were actually Zionists before there was a Zionism in Israel, which was a matter of the Herzl in the late 19th century. But evangelicals far earlier than that were in favor of the restoration of the Jews to a homeland. So there were magnificent gifts of the Reformation. But what is the greatest weakness of covenantalism? Very easy to see. The Lord keeps his word. We don't. Humans don't keep promises well. Nietzsche says this in the Genealogy of Morals. Humans are the animal entitled to make promises, but he goes on a line or two later, the fact is we don't. And of course, read the Exodus. How many chapters is it until we get to Judges? And there's no king in Israel. Everyone's doing what they thought was right in their own eyes. And you see this cycle of life and decadence and renewal and decadence and decline again and again, and the need to renew the covenants. Many people have played off this. If you've read Machiavelli's The Prince, he argues solidly the prince need not keep his word. The prince is what matters. He is the reason of state. So what he promised yesterday has no bearing on what he does today. He can break his word at will. Promise keeping is irrelevant. David Hume mocks the notion of humans being able to keep their promises. And you can see people like the famous John Locke. He's often accused of prejudice and inconsistency because while he guarantees freedom of conscience to Protestants and even to Catholics, which was relatively rare in his day, he does not grant it to atheists. And people have said, well, good John Locke, he was better than his predecessors, but this is just a bridge too far, and he didn't get over this bigotry he had deep down. No. Agree with him or not, Locke had his reasons. If you granted freedom of conscience and you wanted people to keep their word, there had to be some standard of accountability. And the atheists had nothing higher than themselves by which to swear. There was no, so help me God, or whatever. And so you couldn't afford to give freedom of conscience to them because there was no standard for them to keep their words. So he was being consistent within the lights he had at that time. But you can see the very simple and obvious problem of promise keeping. Now, if you think behind freedom is promise keeping. Whenever we say, I will do this, or I'll see you tomorrow, or whatever it is, we're making promises to the future. And in that sense, we're in debt until we fulfill what we said and do what we said. See you at 11, and I'm there at 11. But if we don't follow through, eventually we corrode trust. And you can see in this country the complete collapse of trust at many, many levels, not just the grand institutions like the church and Congress, but at many, many levels of ordinary society. Because in America today, people's word is not their bond. And promise keeping is at a very low ebb, and trust is at a very low ebb in society. And that's the central weakness of covenantalism. The Lord keeps his word. We don't. The third thing, though, that's the strength, and that's the weakness. What's the greatest requirement of covenantalism? The requirement is simply transmission. Again, read the rabbis, and they point out the night of the Passover. Hundreds of years of captivity, and tonight they're going free. What does Moses talk about? What would Churchill have talked about on a Passover night? Does Moses talk about freedom? No. Does he talk about the promised land of milk and honey? No. Does he talk about the dangers of the howling wilderness they're going to cross? No. What does Moses talk about? Children. As I said earlier, for the Jews, schooling far more important than armies for a free society. And both faith and freedom require transmission. So just as constitutional, covenantal societies have the inbuilt requirement of reciprocal relationships, because relationships matter more than regimes, so there has to be a transmission. And you can see in America, in the late 1960s, early 70s, civic education, that passing down of what are the American first principles, collapsed. And there isn't any now in the American public schools. And so freedom is simply not being passed down. A lot of things aren't being passed down. And the generationalism that's grown up, it's a generational thing, you wouldn't understand. That radical relativism between the generations is part of that breakdown, but America's suffering from a severe crisis of transmission, of handing things on from generation to generation. Which comes to a very, very important point. That we are now at a place where the American founding, and remember we're talking about the foundings of society, the American founding has been decisively repudiated by most of the leading intellectuals of this country. There are three reasons. I'll go backwards rather than forwards for a simple reason. One reason is the notion of progressivism. You can see from Woodrow Wilson down to Barack Obama. The framers may have been considered people of genius. Many of them credited them that, but they were an early generation, and we're in a different generation. Time passes, and we've left their notions behind. Dean Acheson. The problem of being an American statesman is how in an atomic age you rule a country that is governed with the constitution of an 18th century farmers' republic. The progressive have gone beyond the framers. The second reason, moving backwards, is the notion of the Charles Beard School, which was sort of quasi-Marxism, that the framers talked all this grand stuff about freedom and the Declaration of Independence, but really it was an excuse to hold their status as Virginia plantation owners and so on. That's been largely debunked. But it's the first and deepest one, I think, that puts its stamp on the present American crisis. And that is the evils and hypocrisy at the heart of the revolution. And I'm thinking of the Constitution of 1787. There is no question that the Constitution of 1787 was a Faustian bargain. There were many there who personally adamantly opposed slavery, but unlike those who opposed it openly, Samuel Hopkins and others, they didn't. They were silent. Why? They needed the votes of the southern states, like South Carolina, and so they were silent. And their silence was a Faustian bargain. And a terrible evil was left intact, which of course was openly hypocritical and a contradiction of all that the Declaration of Independence stood for. Now, of course, Lincoln tackled that and called for a new birth of freedom. But with his death and the following Jim Crow era, it went on. But what's significant is that when Martin Luther King tackled it in the civil rights movement, the 50s and 60s, he did so both within a Christian framework, but also with an acknowledgement that the Declaration gave what he called a promissory note. In other words, he wasn't dismissing the founding documents, far from it. But when he did that in the context of the 60s and the rise of feminism, the anti-war movement, and the free speech movement, and so on, all that he'd exposed and lanced open of American racism was transferred, and somewhere around 1967-68, there was a fateful lurch leftwards. Before that, almost every great intellectual in this country was a liberal, with a capital L. And the American experiment was a grand liberal project in freedom. But suddenly in that lurch leftward, it became hypocritical. And the country was racist and genocidal and militarist and chauvinist and later homophobic and you name it. And since then, tragically, liberalism with a capital L has virtually disappeared as a general intellectual position, And those in the academic and the journalistic and often the entertainment world have been in a left liberal position, which is very, very different. And you can see where we are today. Now, I personally would argue that actually the deepest division in the country now, in America, is bitterly divided, probably as much as at any point since just before the Civil War. Not just politically, or economically, or culturally, or racially, or religiously. But actually the deepest divisions of all, if you go down below the ideas, are really the differences in freedom between the ideas of 1776 and the ideas of 1789. 1789 being filtered through thinkers like Antonio Gramsci, Herbert Marcuse, and of course more recently, Michel Foucault. And so you have ideas that are closer to the French Revolution and its heirs than they are to the American Revolution. And that is actually the deepest, bitterest division in this country at the moment. Now, what needs to be done? If that's right, and the fundamental challenge is actually the nature of freedom, well, you need at least three rather obvious things. First, a grand clarification of freedom. In the 1850s, Lincoln argues, everyone's using the same word, freedom, but the North and the South mean entirely different things about it. We need to clarify what freedom means. And you can see between those revolutions, 1776 and 1789, are fundamental differences. Differences over the source of freedom. 1776, it's a biblical source. 1789, it's the Enlightenment. Differences in anthropology. 1776 has a very realistic view of human nature. John Witherspoon, James Madison, the notion of the separation of powers, checks and balances. Why? The capacity for the abuse of power. Whereas 1789, utopian. Man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. Just throw off a chain or two and we'll all be free, happy, fulfilled. And you see that in the sexual revolution. Read Wilhelm Reich. Just remove the sexual repressions and start when you're 3, 4, or 5, get parents out of the way, and we'll all be sexually fulfilled. You probably need 3 orgasms a week, he says. All will be well and humans will be happy. What utter nonsense. But you go on down the line like that, right through to the end of things, which is a matter of the differences of accountability. And Lord Acton says that's always the final thing. And of course, in 1776, the accountability is under God. And that isn't just 2 words. It is the final check and balance. 1789, no accountability at all. Lord Acton argues that's what went wrong with Athens, that's what went wrong with every revolution that has no final accountability. And when you look at the left today, it has no accountability except itself. So part of our role would be to establish a truly Christian and a Jewish and biblical view of freedom. That difference between, is freedom the permission to do what you like, libertarian style, so long as you don't harm anyone else, or is it the power to do what you ought, obedience to the unenforceable? Many things we could say about that, but that's the first thing. We need to be the champions, the defenders of a realistic, lasting, endurable, sustainable freedom, which is only in the Scripture. Any of you read the New Atheists? It's a simple fact they cannot ground freedom. You go back to J.B. Watson, you go down to B.F. Skinner, the very title of his book, Beyond Dignity and Freedom. Come down to Sam Harris. The front cover of his book is a picture of a puppet. What is freedom? An illusion, he says quite openly. Naturalistic science by itself cannot justify and ground freedom. Only through the Scriptures can you do so. There's the first thing. We are the champions of true, genuine human freedom, and we need to be out there arguing for it. The second thing needed very profoundly is leadership. When I wrote an earlier book on freedom. I was in the Congress, and Congressman had been there more than 30 years, met my wife and I at the door of his office, and he said, "I love your book, but there's one simple problem here on Capitol Hill. There are no statesmen, only politicians." You think of Lincoln. As he moves from Springfield to Washington, he stops off in Philadelphia and makes a great speech in front of Independence Hall and says, in effect, all my thinking comes from the two documents that came out of this building. And he finishes the speech quoting Psalm 137, "May my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I betray these principles." In other words, he not only had courage and all that, he had a great sense of history, and he brought all that to bear on his leadership tackling the huge problems he faced in Washington as the Civil War broke out. Where are leaders like that with history? I've lived in Washington 30 years. I can only think of two people who have that sense of history in what they speak, and neither of them at the very highest level. We need leadership. There's no Lincoln. The president talks about making America great again. He never says what made America great in the first place. And you can see that there's no one speaking for the better angels of 1776. There are many speaking for the darker angels of 1789. And it says, we need leadership. But the third thing, and I mentioned this already, is the restoration of transmission. And of course, we've got to begin within our circles, within our families, within our church circles, and by God's grace, bringing it back into the culture so that generation by generation, they know what is the heritage and the responsibility of those who are citizens in a free country, with each generation rising to bear the responsibility that is theirs in their time. I'll finish with this thought and then throw it over to you. The scholar who more than anyone else is behind the recovery of this notion of covenantalism is a Jewish scholar called Daniel Elazar. He has many, many books on the topic, many of which are fascinating, and he's been followed by all sorts of other scholars. But in one of his meditations, he remarks very simply that covenants came out of the Middle Eastern culture of oases. And he says, think of an oasis. No oasis is larger or more luxuriant or more healthy than what? The wellspring at the heart. And if the wellspring dies and the spring is stopped, the oasis will soon die too. And of course, that's the genius of covenantalism. And you can see in this country how many of the leaders of this country, especially on the liberal left, have blocked the wellspring. At the heart of the sexual revolution is the open admission that the final obstacle to their victory is the church. And those who are caving into some of their ideas are incredibly naive when we are absolutely the central obstacle to their victory. And of course, they're stifling, blocking the wellspring. And we know well that there will be no freedom unless there's that living, vibrant faith that is the wellspring behind freedom and all the other gifts of covenantalism. So to me, it's a sad thing that on the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, say in Washington, I haven't heard a single celebration of the Reformation and endless talk of the Benedict option. Now, bless Rod Dreher's heart, I like him, makes some good points. But the Reformation was a reversal of Benedict. And Benedict was precisely the opposite of all the Reformation stood for in terms of calling and engagement and adventurous thrusting out in society. And that's what we need again in our world, that recovery of the vibrancy of the wellspring. But over to you for our time of discussion when we have time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your message today. My question will be mostly related because of my background. I'm from Colombia, South America. And contrary to the American Republic, it seems like the Latin American world was mostly influenced by by the Roman Catholic view. Let's say, like you mentioned, the Roman institutions view of government. So how can we pass on this covenantalism to the Hispanic world or Latino world right now in this century?
Well, it's largely gone from America too. So I think we have to start wherever we start. For example, marriages. Covenant is the secret for a lasting, solid marriage. And the same is true of all our relationships, say, schools, churches, and so on. So we can begin where we're members of Christian communities already and spread it, and then talk about the value of these things and critique the institutions that are wider, that are simply incapable of sustaining freedom or justice or whatever it is. But start with ourselves. We can't immediately think of turning around Colombia or whatever. No. We've got to start where all of us are, and that's true now. As a church, we've got to live by a higher law in America, which has a lower law or maybe no law at all in many cases, but we are covenantal people and work out what these things mean. So start wherever you are.
Okay, thank you.
Go to this side.
So you draw a distinction between 1776 and 1789 understandings of freedom, claiming that the 1776 understanding had a superior anthropology. But my question is, don't both theories presuppose a deficient understanding of metaphysics? And specifically what I mean is that 1776 liberalism did not assume the existence of formal and final causes, that we inhabit a world full of essences and natures, that the human vocation...
Say it more slowly. You're rattling through these words.
Okay, so 18th century philosophy did not assume the existence of formal and final causes, as Aristotelian and Thomistic philosophy did, that we inhabit a world full of structure and that the human vocation is predetermined once we enter that world. Rather, 18th century political philosophy assumed that the job of the individual is to determine their own conception of the good life, and that the government then protects that conception of the good life that is essentially created ex nihilo by the individual. And doesn't that understanding of freedom, is that not in some ways inimical to the Christian understanding of a created nature, a created structure to the world, and we live into that created structure?
Mm-hmm. I'd say gently, though, that you read the Puritans, they would never talk to the language that you're talking. And you're bringing a whole philosophical sophistication, imposing it on them. Now, but don't for a minute think I'm saying everything that 1776 did was right. I mentioned slavery. It's just one example of the terrible flaws they had. But overall, it was shaped by the scriptures and a biblical understanding, whereas the other one's completely different. Now, you take some of the things you're saying in today's form, at the heart of 1776 is the notion of created reality. Whereas the heart of 1789, in its modern forms, Gramsci, Foucault, and others, is the notion of social constructionism. There's no created reality, not even a Stoic sense. Everything is socially constructed, including, currently, male and female, and so on. A very, very radical view. So I'm saying overall, there's a huge difference in the biblical worldview which is behind 1776. You take the idea, change is slow, incremental, begins in the heart. In other words, the inner precedes the outer, which is 1776 broadly. The French Revolution, you begin with the government, outside, in. As Rousseau says, people should be forced to be free. And the notion of coercion comes in and again. And always when you begin with utopianism, there's a gap between the real and the ideal, and you fill it with coercion, violence. And start looking at the differences. I'm not saying everything that 1776 was right, no. But the broad outlines are thoroughly biblical, and much more realistic than the other. That's all I'm saying. You want to come back?
So I should probably already know the answer to this from reading your book, Fool's Talk. But my question is, how can we be more persuasive in clarifying what freedom means? Not just defining terms, but, as you just said, reaching people's hearts. And what comes to mind is, for example, on college campuses in America, a lot of times freedom of speech is restricted, or there's violence or aggression towards ideas just being spoken in speech in general. So what I'm wondering is, when there's that inhibition or that aggressiveness or lack of wanting to engage, how do we overcome that as Christians, and what platforms or modes would be most effective in reaching people's hearts?
Mm-hmm. There's no simple answer to that, but obviously sometimes we're going to face hostile, occasionally violent responses to us. What did our Lord call us to? Loving our enemies. So we have to start there. We love our enemies. We're committed to the worth of everyone, even those who hate us. And we are committed to truth and a respect for truth in all our arguments. Now you have to consider what is the best way with a particular opponent you may face to reach them. Now there are many liberals who today are toppling into illiberalism without realizing it. And we've got to point out to them how so much of their, for example, the stifling of dissent or the disallowing of conscientious objection is highly illiberal. And often you have whiffs of authoritarianism, even totalitarianism in some of the ways they're arguing now. But you have to think of the person and what is the best way of appealing to this person. But we are standing for freedom, but it always has to be with a genuine love for the person and an absolute respect for the truth in everything we're saying. But you can't answer in general. You have to think of the particular person and what is the treasure of their heart. What do they care about? And then know how to appeal to that.
Thank you.
You don't need to. Josh.
All right. So you said there were the three reasons, or three C's. I want to know what the other.
Said what?
You said there were three C's. The three C's you counted off.
Yeah.
You said there were more than three. I wanted.
Oh, those are the big three that I mentioned.
Yeah.
Covenant, calling, and conscience. But one of the very big ones is what's sometimes called the conception of reality, because that was what is behind the rise of modern science. And if you look at ancient science, came from the Greeks, and it was kept alive for a while by the Muslims, who took over Christian texts that had the Greek ideas in them. But the Royal Society and modern science grew up in the 17th century, and it grew, as Alfred North Whitehead and others have argued, out of conception, a Christian conception of reality. In other words, unlike, say, Hinduism, you're dealing with a world of illusion. In the biblical view, God created an ordered world, and it's possible to investigate it through science and so on. So that's the key one. Another one is the notion of corrigibility, which is a long word, which means the ability, the openness to being corrected and challenged. And that's in the biblical, the Reformation notion of semper reformanda. In other words, they had a Reformation, but they also believed that wasn't once and for all. We all always go wrong. So we all always need to be corrected mid-course all the time. That, for us who are Anglicans, is the confession every Sunday in church, and so on. And the Reformation believed that. So 500 years later, there are many parts of Protestantism that are every bit as decadent and corrupt as the Catholic Church before the Reformation. And that should be no surprise to people who believe in corrigibility. We all often go wrong. The last C I've forgotten for the moment. No, it's the notion of coherence. In other words, people like Abraham Kuyper, who said that if Jesus is Lord, he's Lord of everything, so you think about anything and everything in a coherent, consistent way, Christianly. That's thinking Christianly under the Lordship of Jesus. So those are the lesser ones. Well, not less so really, but the other ones. But thank you for noticing that, Josh.
Thank you for answering the question.
Could you give us some wisdom for
Probably not.
in the political process as Christians, where it often seems like we're left with two really bad options? But I mean, you mentioned, the Benedict option as maybe a cop-out. But how do we, with this covenantal understanding of our nation, possibly, how do we participate in this party versus party conflict, where it often seems like neither party is representing the biblical perspective?
Well, we've got to start with ourselves, living in the way Jesus called us to live. And the moment too much of the church can be accused of hypocrisy in one point after another. So we've got to live consistency. Then secondly, we really have got to love our opponents and love our enemies. And if there's a great mistake, the two great mistakes of the religious right. One, what's called politicization. In other words, trusting politics to do more than politics can do. There's an old saying, the first thing to say about politics is that politics is not the first thing. In other words, politics is downstream from culture, from education, from entertainment, from the press, and so on. So we've got to recognize we can't put all our eggs in the basket of politics. Politics, very important, but we mustn't politicize things. But the other mistake is more Christian. The Christian right tried to do the Lord's work against abortion or whatever. But they tried to do the Lord's work in a kind of whatever it takes way, rather than the old maxim, the Lord's work, the Lord's way. So loving the enemy is an example. Wilberforce, when he started off opposing slavery, is the most vilified man in Europe for a while. Twice physically mugged in the streets by his opponents. Literally hated the royal family, heroes like Lord Nelson. They were all against him. And he consistently loved them, always spoke humbly, graciously. He was also funny. And he won his enemies into being friends over 47 years. So we've got to be consistent, and we've got to genuinely love our enemies, but we've got to stand clearly for the things that are in the interests of everybody, like freedom, the common good, justice, not just for ourselves. Never. I hate the fact that, when Islamophobia came in, homophobia came in, some Christian leaders, one down here in California, called for Christians to talk about Christophobia. We're the victims now. That's terrible. Our Lord told us to pick up our crosses. We're called to count it all joy when we suffer for his name's sake. We should never portray ourselves as victims. And the Jews are correct here. Those who portray themselves as victims come to perceive themselves as victims, and then they paralyze themselves and play the victim. That's the problem of the victim culture. So we should turn away from all stereotyping, all false resorts like victim playing, and stand for the common good of everybody. Now, we're in a situation rather like Elijah. You remember he had 850 against him, and most of the people sitting on the fence, as he says. And we've got a lot of elites openly opposed to us, and activists, and the broad majority of Americans, somewhat confused, often overwhelmed, many times fed up with the challenges. They're sitting on the fence very often. And we've got to say, rather like Elijah did, if Baal is God, follow Baal. In other words, have the courage to say, there are choices. You choose political correctness, the sexual revolution, social constructionism, multicultural, whatever it is. This is your choice. Those will be the consequences, and we're telling you. And with a prophetic voice, have a courage. It's not all up. And we should be like Elijah in that courageous way. If the Lord is God, Baal isn't. If the way of Jesus is true and just and human, and the secret of flourishing and shalom, then the sexual revolution will be a disaster down the line. And we know that. So we shouldn't be shaken by it at all, and so on. So it's a grand moment of prophetic confrontation through clarification. But move out with no fear at all, and humility, and so on.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Guinness, thank you so much for being here and sharing your wisdom with us. You mentioned a call or a hearken to return unto the initial ideas of the framers in 1776.
Say it again slowly.
You mentioned returning to some of the original framework of the framers and some of that thinking and where it comes from. And,
as long as we address the warts and all.
Sure. But part of what I'm wondering is if there's space to continue to construct or think about some of those notions, especially like as a Latino male or as some of my sisters as females who don't always feel or haven't always felt represented by the social location of the framers, namely white males who came with certain ideas which obviously appropriated into colonialism and imperialism and the affects of that. So I'm just wondering if there's, as good as that framework is, and I appreciate that, if there's space to dialogue about how we might think more proactively about that framework in the modern context.
Of course, but you've got to ask what's good about it and where is it bad. For example, I was quite open. The racism was evil and hypocritical, no question. At the same time, you look at what they did. They got religious freedom almost perfectly right from the beginning, in a way which no other big nation in history has ever done. The present mood would throw both of them out. They made a mistake here, throw the whole lot out. That's absolute folly. You've got to make a serious assessment of where they were right and where they were wrong. This is where Martin Luther King was right. They gave everyone a promissory note. And it's time to cash it in for those who they didn't cash it in for. In this case, the slaves, and so on. In other words, beware that in a day of multiculturalism, now I was arguing with the faculty at lunch, the founder of multiculturalism is Horace Callan in 1905. And the idea that the individual matters less than the group, and ethnicity and other things are unmeltable. Or as he put it, you can't change your grandfather. Well, the effect of that is you don't look at individuals, you look at groups. And to the groups that he saw, like ethnic groups, we've added things like generational and, above all, sexual orientation. But at the end of the day, the individual is lost in terms of the group. And then the identity of the nation is lost in terms of the diversity. So be very careful the way you're arguing. The framers properly understood who is excluded from their founding principles. Who?
From the framers' principles?
From their founding principles. Who they didn't cash it in, as Lincoln and others pointed out, Martin Luther King pointed out. But who's excluded from those founding principles?
Well, but perhaps it's the appropriation of those principles which has led us down some of the rabbit holes that we're currently facing, right? Like to deny at a fundamental level that culture plays a part in the imaginary of how we understand our construction, I would just deny that's simply false.
Think it through very radically. I mean, when you talk about social constructionism, my mentor, Peter Berger, is the greatest thinker on the social construction of reality. It's the name of a book. His idea was you look at people's social setting and how it shapes their thinking. So sociology just describes it, and what you're describing is what he calls what passes for knowledge. But you take what people think, what passes for knowledge, and then Berger says you hand it to the philosopher, and it's the philosopher's task to say, all right, it passes for knowledge in this group or that group. Is it true? Is it right or not? That's the second question. The modern social constructionists are far more radical. There is no truth. Everything is only socially constructed, and therefore can be deconstructed, reconstructed, and so on at will, and everything. Now, in Scripture, as the Jews point out, the notion of discrimination today, they borrowed it from civil rights and they apply it, everyone who discriminates is evil. Well, the Jews point out the ultimate discriminator is the Lord. Creation is a process of discrimination. Light and darkness, heaven and earth, and among all the differences, male and female. God is the supreme discriminator. That's a matter of reality. That's not a matter of our human social construction. So be careful the philosophy you buy into, because you go down the line that way, you really will be throwing out baby bathwater and all the entire American experiment. It's flawed, but it is history's most nearly successful experiment in freedom. And if you reject it, the consequences are pretty radical. The French Revolution and its heirs have always ended in reigns of terror and in violence and coercion. Be warned.
Thank you.
We'll probably take two more.
No.
In the interest of time, unless
Yep.
are you having fun with it?
No, people want to go home, I'm sure. So.
We'll take two more.
Hi, Dr. Guinness. I like what you said about the church being sort of the last front against that sort of lowercase l liberalism that's been growing since the 60s. And but I guess my question is, how do we, I feel like when we as Christians try to recapture the 1776 or the covenantalism, we tend to go to sort of a jingoistic flag-waving place where basically we just try to bash liberals, and that's sort of our attempt to, recapture the founders' principles. And how do we parse that out? How do we, not, maybe that's because we're so steeped in sort of the French, Rousseau, use of force, all that, we kind of fight fire with fire, but how do we, I guess, overcome evil with good, rather than just sort of playing on their terms?
Mm-hmm. Keep on down the line. I'm agreeing with you what it said. I'm English. I'm not fighting ultimately for 1776, but for the biblical ideas behind it, about human worth and freedom and so on. These are critical for the world. Where do you ground human dignity? The framers understood that, but they didn't apply it to everyone. We want to apply it to everyone. We believe in human worth. I love the old Jewish saying that when humans make something in their image in a mint, they all turn out the same, coins. When God makes something in his image, they're all different. That's us. We have the highest view of human worth and of the dignity of difference and genuine diversity. So never baptize 1776 as the ultimate. But I'm just saying, just as a matter of record, unlike the French Revolution, it was decisively shaped by the scriptures, not perfectly, but decisively. Or as historians point out, freedom in the West speaks with a Hebrew accent. It comes from the Bible, not anywhere else, and that's what we're championing. So no jingoism and whatever you were saying at the beginning. Of course not. My great hero is Wilberforce. My ancestor who founded our family brewery was one of the business people who supported Wilberforce. And so you had the reformers, and you had the business people who provided the money and various things for the things to go forward. He is the greatest social reformer in all human history. He wasn't perfect, but my word, he was so different from today's, different from even, say, American abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison. Often, Garrison was so extreme in abolition that he confirmed the South in their rejecting him. And often he would speak, and he would stir up many people joining the other side. Wilberforce was the opposite. He won people by his love and his winsomeness and so on, and eventually he won the cause. So yes, Christianly doing it.
Thank you.
Last one.
Hi, hello, sir. My name is Kayla, and as I was hearing you and you were mentioning about John Locke and atheists and how they don't have anything higher than themselves, and I was curious in your opinion, and according to John Locke, were atheists not given conscious freedom because they were incapable of morally good decisions? Like, is this due to them not having anything higher than themselves? And can you please elaborate on your claim?
Sorry, what was the question, though, coming out of it?
it's like 3 in 1. I'm not sure, but hey, that's Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Okay.
Well, I think today, we be clear, we give freedom of conscience to everybody. And that was Roger Williams' radical new idea, everybody. And he included what he called infidels, we call them atheists. He included what he called Muslimen, we call them Muslims. And that was incredibly radical, and people thought he was utopian and absurd. Everything would fall apart. And I think that's where Christians would be today. You give freedom of conscience for everybody. But, you have to see that to create a society which does that, there are certain requirements. I mentioned transmission. You have to teach people how to deal with differences with love for the person, respect for truth, know how to argue persuasively, not coercively. There are all sorts of simple prerequisites you have to build in to a society which is going to be that open and that free. And if you don't build them in, it will collapse, just as the American public square is collapsing today. But Locke wasn't that consistent, great man though he was. But Locke, and I'll finish with this, Locke's favorite term was toleration. And there's an understanding today that tolerance is not the best term, because at the heart of tolerance is the power equation. The strong tolerate the weak. The majority tolerates the minority. The government tolerates... No, that's not religious freedom. Religious freedom is an absolute thing. It's not a matter of power equations and condescension or a patronizing whatever. So I think there's agreement today that Locke, he went further than people of the earlier generation, but didn't go far enough. And we would give religious freedom for everybody, bar exceptions. But we recognize, for ourselves, you've got to have a standard of accountability. And many people don't. And if you take covenantalism, separation, you didn't ask this, I'm going a bit beyond it. Separation of powers comes from the Bible, as well as Montesquieu and others. And for the Jews, they call it the 3 crowns. You have the monarchy, the priesthood, and the prophets. The prophets were the first social critics in history, and their standard of accountability was what? The covenant. And they called the people back and judged them in the light of their behavior by the standards of the covenant. And we need people today to do that in America. So I may have missed your question. Forgive me if I did. Thank you.
You've been a wonderful audience. That's all the time we have for tonight. Let's show our appreciation to Oz once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, allow me to close in prayer for you and for Biola and for this great country in which we're living. Lord, as we think of Exodus and your call to the Egyptians to let your people go, and that you wanted a free people to worship you freely, and gave them that framework of the covenant in which to live. We thank you for those who came to this country who did love you with all their hearts, and for better or worse, provided so many good foundations. And we confess that we have gone so far, but we ask that you will have mercy on the mess today and turn the country around to you. And we know we can't do it, but we look to you and ask that you will make each of us faithful in our circles and our callings, and give us the privilege of seeing you work in our time. Lord, help us that we may stand for you in a way that brings glory to your great name. And we ask it in your great name, Jesus. Amen. Amen.